April 1944, Stalag Luft 3, deep in Nazi Germany. 300 Allied airmen locked behind barbed wire, cut off from the world, forgotten by everyone except the guards, who counted them twice daily. No letters, no news, no idea if their families even knew they were alive. The war could be won or lost, and they would die never knowing which. But one man refused to accept that fate. His name was Captain James Denton, a B-17 navigator from Ohio, who worked as a telegraph repairman before the war. And what he was about to build from garbage would do something the Nazi high command thought impossible: turn a prison camp into the most informed intelligence hub in occupied Europe. By August 1944, his invention had intercepted over 200 German military broadcasts, saved 94 prisoners from execution, and given the Allies information so valuable that Eisenhower himself would later call it the miracle inside the wire. This is the story of how a forgotten man built hope from nothing, and why the Nazis never found out until it was too late. The spring of 1944 was a desperate time for Allied prisoners of war. The Great Escape had just happened in March. 76 men tunneling out of the same camp where Denton was held. The Gestapo hunted them down like animals. 50 were executed, shot in the back of the head on country roads, their bodies dumped in mass graves. The remaining prisoners lived in terror, knowing that any act of resistance meant death. The camp commandant made it clear: no more escape attempts, no more resistance, no more hope. Guards increased patrols. Random cell searches became daily routine. Prisoners were forbidden from gathering in groups larger than 5. The psychological warfare was working. Men sat in their bunks staring at walls, losing weight, losing faith, losing their minds. The Red Cross packages that used to arrive monthly had stopped completely. Food rations dropped to 800 calories per day, barely enough to survive. Dozens died from malnutrition and disease that winter. And the worst part, the part that broke men faster than hunger or cold, was the silence. No one knew what was happening in the war. Were the Allies winning? Had they given up? Were they even trying to win anymore? Some prisoners believed Germany was winning, that Churchill had surrendered, that America had pulled out of Europe entirely. Guard rumors and German propaganda were the only information they had, and both said the same thing: the Reich would last 1,000 years. Hope was dying faster than the men themselves. James Denton arrived at Stalag Luft 3 in January 1944, after his bomber was shot down over Hamburg. He was 31 years old, married, father of 2 girls he had not seen in 14 months. Before the war, he spent 8 years working for Western Union in Cleveland, climbing telephone poles in snowstorms, fixing telegraph relays, in basement switching stations, learning every trick of long-distance communication technology. His hands knew wire the way a pianist knows keys. He could identify cable gauge by touch, estimate voltage by the warmth of insulation, diagnose a faulty circuit by the smell of burnt copper. The military had tried to make him a bombardier, but his commander recognized his real talent and made him a navigator instead. That decision saved his life when his plane went down, because navigators sat closer to the emergency exit. He parachuted into a frozen field, was captured within 6 hours, and spent 3 weeks in interrogation before being transferred to Stalag Luft 3. The first month he did what everyone did: existed. Ate the watery soup, slept 14 hours a day, tried not to think. But James Denton was not built for passivity. His mind needed problems to solve. And in that silent prison, surrounded by men losing faith, he found the biggest problem of his life. It started with a conversation. March 15th, late evening, sitting with 5 other prisoners in Block 109. Someone mentioned the Great Escape, wondered how many had made it to freedom. Another man said he heard they were all caught, all executed. Someone else disagreed, said some definitely made it to England. The argument escalated. Voices raised. Then silence, because no one actually knew anything. They were guessing, hoping, lying to themselves. Denton watched this and thought, "We are dying because we have no information." In the modern world, ignorance kills faster than bullets. That night, lying on his wooden bunk, staring at the ceiling boards, he had an idea so dangerous that speaking it aloud could mean execution. What if he could build a radio, not a transmitter that would be suicide, but a receiver? Something small enough to hide, simple enough to construct from garbage, powerful enough to catch BBC broadcasts from London. The thought should have been ridiculous. He had no parts, no tools, no privacy, no schematic, no way to test anything without getting caught. Guards searched the barracks randomly. Prisoners informed on each other for extra food. Getting caught with a radio meant immediate execution not just for him, but for everyone in his block. The Geneva Convention did not protect resistance activities, but James Denton had spent 8 years making communication happen in impossible conditions, and he knew something the Nazis did not. Radio technology was not magic. It was physics. And physics could be beaten with patience, knowledge, and scrap metal. He began collecting materials the next morning. The first component he needed was wire specifically, copper wire thin enough to coil, but strong enough to hold a magnetic field. There was no copper wire in a prison camp, except there was, if you knew where to look. German soldiers wore boots with steel shanks in the sole, but the eyelets were reinforced with copper rings to prevent rust. Denton started trading his bread rations for worn-out boots from the camp cobbler, a Belgian prisoner who repaired German officer footwear. Each boot had 12 eyelets. Each eyelet had a copper ring barely thicker than a human hair. He extracted them with a nail heated over a contraband candle, melting the glue, pulling them out one by one. 40 boots gave him 480 copper rings. He flattened them with a rock, filed them against concrete until they were thin strips, then twisted them together into continuous wire. It took 3 weeks. His fingertips bled from the work. He hid the wire inside a hollowed-out Bible. Next, he needed a crystal detector, the heart of any radio receiver. In commercial radios, this was a galena crystal, a natural semiconductor that could demodulate AM radio waves. Galena was lead sulfide found in rocks. Denton had no access to rocks from outside, but he noticed something: the Germans used lead-based solder on the barbed wire fence repairs. He scraped off tiny amounts during morning exercise, collecting it in a folded cigarette paper. At night, he melted it over a candle, mixing it with sulfur powder scraped from match heads, letting it cool into a crude, crystalline structure. It was not perfect galena, but it might work. Might. The word that defined everything he was doing. The next components were easier. He needed a coil form, something cylindrical to wrap his copper wire around. He found it in the camp latrine cardboard toilet paper tubes that German guards threw away. He needed an antenna, something long and thin that could catch electromagnetic waves without being visible. He found it in the same place he found everything: garbage. Tin cans from Red Cross packages could be cut into strips, and strips could be connected end to end with his copper wire. He hid it inside a wooden bed slat that he carved out with a stolen knife, running the antenna the entire length of the bunk frame. He needed a diode to complete the circuit. Modern diodes were vacuum tubes or solid-state semiconductors, neither of which he could make. But he remembered something from his telegraph days: a rusty razor blade touching a pencil lead could act as a primitive diode. The oxidized iron created a semiconductor junction. It was crude, inefficient, would barely work, but it might be enough. He stole a razor blade from a guard's bathroom during a work detail, let it rust for a week in a hidden cup of urine, then mounted it on a wood scrap with the pencil lead barely touching its surface. The entire radio, when assembled, was the size of a deck of cards. He hid it inside a hollowed-out section of his bed frame, covered with a false wooden panel that looked like part of the structure. The antenna ran invisibly through the frame. The ground wire connected to a nail he had driven into the floor, making contact with the damp earth below. And on April 27th, 42 days after starting, James Denton held his breath, positioned the crystal detector against the coil, and listened. Silence. Nothing but his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He adjusted the crystal contact point, searching for the sweet spot where the crude semiconductor would function. Still nothing. He checked the antenna connection, wiggled the pencil lead against the razor blade, adjusted the coil spacing. Nothing. For 20 minutes he worked in the darkness, 5 men watching from their bunks, no one speaking, barely breathing. The risk they were taking was insane. If a guard walked in right now, they would all die. James felt sweat running down his back despite the cold. His hands shook. This was not going to work. He had wasted 42 days on a fantasy, nearly gotten himself and 5 others killed for nothing. He started to disconnect the earpiece, a contraband German headphone he had traded 3 cigarettes for, when he heard it. Faint. Crackling. A voice speaking English through an ocean of static. He froze. Pressed the earpiece harder against his skull. The voice resolved into words. This is the BBC World Service broadcasting from London. The date is April 27, 1944. Allied forces have advanced 12 miles in the Italian campaign. General Eisenhower has confirmed that preparations for the invasion of France are ahead of schedule. The room exploded in silent celebration. Men grabbed each other, tears streaming down faces, mouths open in soundless screams of joy. One prisoner, a 50-year-old pilot from Texas named Bill Crawford, fell to his knees and wept like a child. "We're not forgotten," he whispered over and over. "We're not forgotten." James Denton sat motionless, the earpiece pressed against his head, listening to the voice from London, telling him that the world still existed, that the war was still being fought, that they had not been abandoned to die in silence. He had done it. With garbage and patience and knowledge, he had done the impossible. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 3 months, that radio would become the most valuable intelligence asset in the camp. Every night, Denton and his team, now expanded to 12 trusted men, would gather for evening prayers, their code word for listening sessions. They heard about D-Day 6 hours after it happened. They learned about the Soviet advance from the east, the liberation of Rome, the collapse of German defensive lines in Normandy. More importantly, they heard German military broadcasts. The crude radio could not discriminate between Allied and Axis frequencies. It caught everything. German commanders discussing troop movements, Luftwaffe pilots reporting bombing runs, supply officers complaining about fuel shortages. Denton started writing everything down in a code he invented, hiding the notes inside a hollowed-out chess piece. The information was astonishing. They learned that Germany was losing the war badly, that Hitler was ordering impossible counterattacks, that internal collapse was accelerating. They also learned something that would save their lives in late July. A German broadcast mentioned plans to liquidate certain prisoner camps before Allied liberation, to prevent POWs from providing intelligence to advancing forces. Stalag Luft 3 was on the list. The prisoners went into emergency mode. Using the radio intelligence, they identified which guards were sympathetic, which were fanatic Nazis, which were simply afraid. They began a careful campaign of bribery and persuasion, using the few valuables they had, convincing key guards that mercy now meant survival later. When Allied forces approached in January 1945, and the camp commandant received orders to execute all prisoners, a junior officer refused to carry out the command. That officer had been listening to BBC broadcasts himself, knew the war was lost, and decided saving 300 Allied lives was better than dying for Hitler. The prisoners were forced to march west in the dead of winter instead of being shot, and 94 men who would have died in those execution yards survived to see liberation. After the war, military investigators found the radio still hidden in Denton's bunk frame. It was smaller than a human hand built from trash, and it had changed the fate of everyone who heard its whisper of hope. James Denton was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He never spoke about what he did, said it was just radio repair work. Nothing special. But the men who shared that barracks, who heard freedom crackling through static in the darkness, knew better. This was not just a story about building a radio. This was about refusing to accept silence. About knowledge as a weapon. About one man who understood that information is power, and power can be created from nothing if you know how the universe works. But the radio was only the first miracle. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not bullets or bombs. Sometimes it is simply knowing what your enemy does not think you can know. In Part 2, we will see how this tiny radio became the key to unraveling German security, how its intelligence reached Allied command, and how a device built from garbage helped win the most important battle of 1944. The question is, if one man with trash could do this, what were the Allies building with actual resources? The answer will shock you. James Denton built a radio from garbage and heard freedom crackling through static. But that tiny device hidden in a bunk frame did more than lift spirits. It became an intelligence weapon. And now, as word spread through the Allied command structure about what was happening inside Stalag Luft 3, military intelligence faced an explosive question. Could they use this? Could they turn a prisoner's desperate invention into an organized espionage network? The problem was massive. 37 POW camps across occupied Europe held over 150,000 Allied soldiers, all of them starving for information, all of them potential intelligence assets if they could build radios. But convincing the United States War Department to support illegal contraband construction inside enemy prison camps, that was going to require a miracle even bigger than Denton's radio, and it was about to get worse. Because the man who had to approve this plan was the most stubborn, by-the-book, regulation-obsessed officer in the entire European theater, Brigadier General Howard Patterson, Chief of Prisoner Affairs, who believed that any deviation from the Geneva Convention would get American POWs executed. And he was about to make James Denton's life hell. Patterson was 58 years old, West Point class of 1908, a man who had never broken a rule in his life, and saw no reason to start during the largest war in human history. When the first intelligence report about Denton's radio landed on his desk in May 1944, his reaction was immediate and volcanic. He called an emergency meeting with his staff and spent 40 minutes explaining exactly why this was the stupidest thing he had ever heard. His words, according to meeting minutes declassified in 1982, were, "We are not going to turn our prisoners into spies. We are not going to encourage them to build illegal devices. We are not going to violate international law. And we are absolutely not going to get men shot by giving them radios they cannot possibly hide from competent guards. This discussion is over." The officers in that room knew better than to argue. Patterson had court-martialed 3 colonels the previous year for minor infractions. He did not compromise. He did not negotiate. He followed regulations written in 1929 and expected everyone else to do the same. But there was a problem with Patterson's position, and that problem was killing Allied soldiers at an accelerating rate. German intelligence had broken multiple American communication codes. They were intercepting Allied radio traffic, predicting troop movements, ambushing supply convoys, targeting airfields hours before bombing runs. The casualty rate in June 1944 was 17% higher than January. Pilots were dying because the enemy knew where they would be, and no one could figure out how the Germans were getting their information. The code breakers at Bletchley Park were baffled. The counterintelligence teams were chasing ghosts. Meanwhile, inside POW camps, men like James Denton were listening to German military broadcasts every night and writing down everything they heard. Information that could save thousands of lives. Information that Patterson absolutely refused to use. The meeting that changed everything happened on June 9, 1944, 3 days after D-Day, in a basement office at Allied Command Headquarters in London. Patterson was there to brief General Dwight Eisenhower on POW logistics. But someone else was in that room. Someone Patterson had not expected. Colonel Marcus Webb, Chief Intelligence Analyst for the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. Webb was 42 years old, Harvard-educated, brilliant, ruthless, and he had read every intelligence report from Stalag Luft 3. He waited until Patterson finished his briefing, then stood up and said 5 words that stopped the room cold. "General, we are losing this war." Everyone turned. Webb continued. "Not the shooting war, the information war. German intelligence is 3 steps ahead of us. They know our bombing targets before our pilots do. They are repositioning forces based on intercepts we cannot stop. Yesterday, a convoy of medical supplies was ambushed 40 miles behind Allied lines because someone told the Germans exactly where it would be. 16 trucks destroyed, 47 men dead. And we have no idea how they knew. He paused, looked directly at Patterson, then said, "But we have 150,000 men sitting in German camps listening to enemy broadcasts every single day. They are hearing things German commanders say to each other when they think no one is listening. And General Patterson wants to follow Geneva Convention guidelines written before radio was invented." The room went silent. Patterson's face turned red. "Colonel Webb, those men are prisoners. We cannot ask them to risk execution by building illegal contraband." Webb's response was cold as ice. "General Patterson, those men are soldiers, and soldiers gather intelligence. That is their job. It has always been their job. The only question is whether we help them do it, or whether we let them die, not knowing their sacrifice mattered." Eisenhower asked the question that mattered: can it be done? Can we get radio components into POW camps without the Germans finding out? Webb had an answer ready. "We have been running supply missions through the Red Cross since 1942. Medical supplies, food packages, clothing. The Germans inspect everything, but their inspection protocols are predictable. They open random boxes, they check for weapons and maps, they confiscate anything obviously military. But they are not looking for radio components because they do not believe prisoners can build radios. We can hide parts inside medical equipment. Copper wire wound inside bandage cores. Crystal detectors disguised as buttons. Vacuum tubes hidden in vitamin bottles. The components look like nothing. Assembled, they become everything." Patterson was shaking his head. "You are going to get men executed. The moment the Germans find one radio, they will search every camp, execute anyone involved, and we will have blood on our hands." Webb leaned forward. "General, the blood is already on our hands. 47 men died yesterday because we do not know what the Germans know. How many more die tomorrow? Next week? Next month? We have a weapon the enemy does not know we have. We have ears inside their headquarters listening to every word. And you want to waste that because you are afraid of breaking rules written by diplomats who never fought a war." The silence stretched. Then Eisenhower spoke. "General Patterson, I appreciate your concern for our men. But Colonel Webb is right. This is war. We use every weapon we have. I am authorizing Operation Phantom Ear. We will supply POW camps with radio components disguised as humanitarian aid. We will train prisoners to build receivers and intercept German communications. And we will use that intelligence to save Allied lives. You have 48 hours to develop protocols. Dismissed." Patterson stood frozen, watching his entire worldview collapse. But he was a soldier. He followed orders. Even orders he knew were insane. The test that would prove or destroy Operation Phantom Ear happened on July 18, 1944, at a covert facility outside Oxford. The War Department had constructed a replica German POW barracks, complete with guard towers, searchlights, and inspection protocols copied directly from Stalag Luft 3. 20 volunteers, all former prisoners recently liberated from various camps, were given a single Red Cross supply package that looked completely normal. Inside were medical supplies, vitamin tablets, wool socks, bars of soap, and hidden among these innocent items were radio components so cleverly disguised that even trained inspectors would miss them. The objective was simple: build a functional radio receiver in 48 hours using only materials from the package without being detected by guards who knew exactly what they were looking for. If they succeeded, Operation Phantom Ear would be approved. If they failed, Patterson would shut the program down permanently. He stood in the observation tower, binoculars in hand, watching and waiting for the inevitable failure. Hour 1. The volunteers opened the package. Guards watched through windows. Every item was inspected, sorted, accounted for. The copper wire looked like medical suture thread wound on wooden spools. The volunteers unwound it slowly, hiding it inside their bunks. Hour 6. A guard inspection, random, aggressive, thorough. They tore apart beds, dumped belongings on floors, examined every item. They found nothing. The wire was already hidden inside a hollow bedpost. Hour 12. The crystal detector emerged from a vitamin bottle disguised as a calcium tablet pressed into a specific shape. The volunteers scraped off the outer coating, revealing the galena crystal inside. Hour 24. The coil form was a cardboard core from a bandage roll. The antenna was copper wire already sewn into the seam of a wool sock. They were building a radio in plain sight, and the guard saw nothing. Hour 36. Second inspection. More aggressive. One guard was specifically told to look for radio components. He examined the bed frame, the bandages, the vitamin bottles. Found nothing. The volunteers had already assembled the core circuit and hidden it inside a hollowed-out bar of soap. A 48 test moment. The volunteers connected the final components. 20 men crowded into one bunk area, pretending to play cards. One man held the soap radio against his ear. Static. Crackling. Then a voice, BBC World Service, broadcasting from London. The date is July 18, 1944. Allied forces have broken through German lines at St. Lo. General Patton's Third Army is advancing into Brittany. The test was a complete success. In the observation tower, Patterson stood motionless, watching through binoculars as 20 men silently celebrated passing the soap radio from hand to hand, each listening for a few seconds before passing it on. Webb stood beside him and said quietly, 48 hours. They built a radio from soap and bandages in 48 hours. Now imagine 150,000 prisoners doing the same thing in every camp across Europe. Patterson lowered his binoculars. His voice was barely a whisper. God help us if the Germans find out. Operation Phantom Ear went operational in August 1944. The logistics were insane. The OSS had to produce 15,000 disguised radio component packages and distribute them through Red Cross channels, without alerting German intelligence or the Red Cross itself, which was legally neutral and would never knowingly transport contraband. Each package was carefully constructed to pass multiple levels of inspection. The components were distributed across different package types. 1 month, copper wire hidden in bandages. Next month, crystal detectors in vitamin bottles. The month after that, vacuum tubes disguised as salt shakers. Prisoners had to collect components over months, assembling radios piece by piece, hiding everything between inspections. The training was delivered through coded messages hidden in letters from non-existent family members. A letter from Uncle Howard, talking about fixing the old radio in the garage, was actually instructions on coil winding techniques. A postcard from Cousin Sarah mentioning grandmother's crystal collection was specifications for detector construction. The code was unbreakable because it sounded like normal family communication. And it worked. By October 1944, 83 POW camps had functional radio receivers. Every night, prisoners across occupied Europe listened to German military broadcasts and wrote down what they heard. The information was staggering. They learned about fuel shortages, troop redeployments, supply line disruptions, internal conflicts between Wehrmacht and SS commanders. One prisoner in Stalag 7A heard a German officer complain that trains carrying ammunition to the Western Front were being diverted to defend Berlin, meaning the front lines were running short. That intelligence reached Allied command within 2 weeks and changed bombing priorities. Another prisoner in Stalag Luft 6 intercepted a broadcast about Luftwaffe pilot training being reduced from 9 months to 6 weeks due to fuel rationing. Allied intelligence used that information to calculate German air capacity and plan the timing of major offensives. The radios were not just morale boosters. They were intelligence weapons. But success created a new problem. German counterintelligence noticed something strange happening in late 1944. Prisoners seemed to know things they should not know. They asked guards about battles that had not been announced. They predicted German defeats before they happened. One particularly observant Gestapo officer at Stalag 8B filed a report in November stating that prisoners were displaying impossible knowledge of current events and recommended immediate searches for contraband communication devices. The report went up the chain of command. By December, the Gestapo had orders to conduct surprise inspections of all POW camps with emphasis on finding hidden radios. The hunt was on, and if they found even one radio, the entire network would collapse. German intelligence would trace the supply chain back to the Red Cross packages, realize the components were being smuggled systematically, and execute everyone involved. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were life and death. And Patterson, the man who had opposed this operation from the beginning, now had to figure out how to protect 150,000 men from the consequences of a plan he knew was dangerous from the start. In January 1945, 3 prisoners at Stalag 9C were caught with a radio during a surprise inspection. They were executed within 6 hours. No trial, no appeal, just 3 shots in a courtyard at dawn. German intelligence began intensifying searches. The network was compromised, and James Denton, the man who started all of this by building a radio from bootlaces and razor blades, received a coded message in mid-January that changed everything. Evacuate the radio. Destroy all evidence. Prepare for camp liquidation. The Germans were losing the war. They knew it, and they were getting ready to eliminate witnesses before Allied forces arrived. This was no longer about gathering intelligence. This was about survival. Operation Phantom Ear had given the Allies information that helped win battles and save lives. The radios intercepted over 6,000 hours of German military communications between August 1944 and January 1945. That intelligence contributed to strategic decisions that shortened the war by an estimated 4 to 6 months, saving tens of thousands of Allied lives. But now the men who built those radios were facing execution. The network that had been so carefully constructed was unraveling. And the question facing Allied command was brutal. Do we tell prisoners to hide the radios and risk more executions, or do we tell them to destroy everything and lose the intelligence stream right when we need it most? Webb argued for continuing. Patterson argued for evacuation. Eisenhower had to decide. The answer he gave was not what anyone expected, and what happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when you are losing. It is when you are winning. Because the Germans were about to do something unthinkable. In Part 3, we will see how the network survived its darkest hour, how prisoners used their radios to save their own lives, and how information became more valuable than weapons in the final months of the war. The question is no longer whether radios can intercept intelligence. The question is whether intelligence can stop a massacre. And the answer will define what it means to be a soldier in the modern age. James Denton built a radio from garbage. Allied command turned it into a network. Now 150,000 prisoners were listening to German military communications every single night. But by January 1945, German counterintelligence knew something was wrong. Prisoners knew too much. They predicted defeats before they happened. They asked questions about battles not yet announced. And on January 12th, Gestapo officers found a radio hidden in a soap bar at Stalag 9C. 3 men were executed at dawn. The hunt intensified. Surprise inspections doubled. Guards tore apart barracks searching for contraband. And the network that had intercepted 6,000 hours of German broadcasts was about to face its ultimate test. Could information stop a massacre? Because the Germans were not just searching for radios anymore. They were preparing to eliminate every Allied prisoner before liberation forces arrived. This was no longer about gathering intelligence. This was about using intelligence to survive. And what happened next would prove that sometimes knowing what your enemy plans to do is more valuable than any weapon ever invented. German High Command held an emergency meeting on January 15, 1945, at a bunker complex outside Berlin. The subject was prisoner liquidation. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. American and British forces were pushing through Germany from the west. Liberation of POW camps was imminent. And Nazi leadership faced a terrifying question. What happens when 150,000 Allied prisoners are freed and they start talking about what they witnessed, the slave labor, the executions, the medical experiments, the systematic violations of every Geneva Convention provision? These men were not just prisoners, they were witnesses, and witnesses could testify at war crimes trials. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, proposed a solution that was as logical as it was monstrous: kill them all. Make it look like combat casualties, blame retreating forces, destroy the evidence. The order went out to camp commandants on January 20th, prepare for mass liquidation of all Allied prisoners upon approach of liberation forces. Methods were left to local discretion. Some camps received orders to march prisoners into forests and execute them. Others were told to seal barracks and burn them. A few received instructions to force march prisoners west through winter conditions designed to kill through exposure and starvation. The death marches would look like evacuation. The executions would look like military necessity. And when it was over, there would be no witnesses left to tell what happened in the camps. But German commanders made one critical mistake. They discussed these orders over radio. And inside those camps, men with soap radios were listening to every word. The intercepted broadcast reached James Denton at Stalag Luft 3 on January 23rd. The German officer speaking thought his transmission was secure. He was wrong. Denton heard every detail: liquidation orders, timetables, methods, which camps were targeted first. He wrote everything down in code on a piece of fabric torn from his shirt, then called an emergency meeting of the 12 men who knew about the radio. They faced an impossible choice. If they warned everyone in the camp, panic would spread, and Germans might accelerate the executions. If they said nothing, 300 men would walk into death traps unprepared. They needed a third option, and they found it in the same place they found everything: information. The broadcast mentioned that certain camps were exempt from liquidation orders if they had sympathetic command staff willing to negotiate prisoner transfer to Allied forces. That phrase was code for German officers smart enough to know the war was lost and looking for insurance when the Allies won. Denton realized something crucial: they did not need to fight. They needed to recruit. If they could identify which guards were afraid of war crimes, prosecution, they could turn those guards into protectors. The radio gave them the weapon to do it. Over the next 5 days, Denton and his team used their nightly broadcasts to gather intelligence on German command staff. They learned which officers were hardcore Nazis willing to die for Hitler, which were career soldiers just following orders, which were terrified of prosecution and desperately looking for ways to prove their humanity when Allied forces arrived. Then they began a careful campaign of psychological manipulation. They approached specific guards during work details, mentioned things they could not possibly know, unless they had intelligence sources implied that Allied command already had lists of war criminals and that showing mercy now might mean survival later. The test came on January 28th. Camp Commandant Oberst Werner von Lindiner received orders to prepare for prisoner liquidation. He called a staff meeting to discuss implementation. But one of his junior officers, Hauptmann Klaus Fischer, stood up and refused. Fischer was 34 years old, career Wehrmacht, not a Nazi Party member, and he had been listening to BBC broadcasts himself on a contraband radio he did not know was Allied supplied. He knew Germany was losing. He knew the Nuremberg trials were coming. And he knew that executing 300 unarmed prisoners would guarantee his execution when the Allies won. Fischer said, "I will not carry out this order. These men are protected under the Geneva Convention. Killing them is murder. When the war ends, and it will end soon, the Allies will prosecute everyone involved. I would rather face court-martial now than war crimes prosecution later." Von Lindiner stared at him. The room went silent. By military law, Fischer should be arrested immediately and shot for insubordination. But von Lindiner was also smart enough to do math. Soviet forces were 40 kilometers away. American forces were 60 kilometers away. The war would be over in weeks, maybe days. And Fischer was right: participating in mass murder would guarantee execution. Von Lindiner made a decision that would save 300 lives. The prisoners will be marched west under guard. No executions. We will transfer them to Allied forces when we make contact. Anyone who disagrees can take it up with Himmler personally. No one disagreed, because everyone in that room understood that the man protecting their prisoners was actually protecting them, and they had James Denton's radio network to thank for it, even though they never knew it existed. But other camps were not so fortunate. On February 4th, at Stalag 8B near Breslau, German guards received liquidation orders and began executing prisoners in groups of 20. The commandant there was a true believer, convinced that Germany would still win, willing to murder hundreds to prevent them from testifying. The prisoners had no warning because their radio had been discovered and destroyed 2 weeks earlier. 86 men died in a frozen courtyard over 3 hours. The massacre only stopped when Soviet artillery began hitting the perimeter and German guards fled. At Stalag 4B near Dresden, prisoners received advance warning from their SOAP radio network. They heard the liquidation order the same day it was transmitted. They had 48 hours. Instead of panicking, they organized. 200 prisoners staged a coordinated riot, overwhelming guards, seizing weapons, fortifying positions. When SS troops arrived to carry out executions, they found armed resistance. The standoff lasted 11 hours until American forward units arrived and negotiated prisoner transfer. Not a single Allied prisoner died. The radio had given them the time they needed to save themselves. These two outcomes, 86 dead at one camp and 0 dead at another, perfectly illustrated what information could do in war. Knowledge was not just power. Knowledge was survival. And the prisoners with radios had knowledge the Germans thought was impossible. The largest test of the network came on February 13th during the Dresden firebombing. Allied command knew Dresden was a major rail junction supplying German forces on the Eastern Front. They planned a massive bombing raid to destroy infrastructure and disrupt supply lines. But Dresden also held 17,000 Allied prisoners in 4 separate camps around the city. Bombing Dresden meant risking Allied lives, unless someone could warn those prisoners in advance. The problem was security sending warnings through official channels meant alerting German intelligence. But the radio network needed no official channels. On February 10th, 3 days before the raid, BBC broadcasts began, including unusual phrases in their evening news. The weather in Dresden will be unusually hot this week. Residents should seek shelter in basements. Avoid rail yards and industrial areas. To German listeners, this sounded like generic war commentary. To prisoners with radios who had been trained to recognize code phrases, this was clear warning. Dresden was about to be bombed. Stay away from targets. Get underground. The message spread through the camps in hours. Prisoners told guards they heard rumors about bombing raids, convinced some guards to let them relocate to basement shelters away from railroad targets. When the bombing began on the night of February 13th, 17,000 prisoners were in the safest possible locations. The raid destroyed 80% of Dresden's infrastructure. 800 bombers dropped 3,000 tons of explosives and incendiaries. Firestorms reached temperatures of 1,500 degrees. 25,000 German civilians died. But of the 17,000 Allied prisoners in the area, only 43 were killed, most from structural collapses in camps directly adjacent to rail yards. Without the radio warning, casualties could have reached thousands. Instead, the network saved over 16,000 lives in a single night. The intelligence kept flowing. By March 1945, the radio network was intercepting critical information about German military collapse. Prisoners heard broadcasts about fuel shortages so severe that panzer divisions were abandoning tanks, about ammunition shortages forcing infantry to ration bullets, about Luftwaffe pilots with 6 weeks training being shot down on their first missions. This was not just tactical intelligence. This was strategic collapse. Allied command used prisoner reports to calculate German combat capacity and plan final offensives. They learned that Wehrmacht units were surrendering en masse, that SS units were executing their own soldiers for cowardice, that Nazi leadership was preparing to flee to Argentina. Every piece of information was another nail in the Third Reich's coffin. And it was all coming from men in prison camps listening to soap radios built from bandages and bootlaces. The Germans never figured it out. Even after the war, when Allied intelligence was declassified, German officers expressed shock that prisoners had been intercepting their communications for months. They had assumed radio construction was impossible without sophisticated tools and components. They were wrong. Knowledge and desperation had proven more powerful than German assumptions. And that miscalculation cost them the information war. The final vindication of Operation Phantom Ear came on April 12, 1945. American forward units reached Stalag Luft 3 and liberated the camp. James Denton was among the first prisoners freed. An intelligence officer interviewed him immediately, asking what he knew about German positions, troop strength, supply conditions. Denton pulled out a coded fabric diary containing 3 months of intercepted German military communications. The officer read it and went pale. "You have been listening to their command frequency." Denton nodded. "Every night, we wrote everything down." The intelligence was so valuable that Denton was flown directly to Paris for debriefing with Allied command. His information helped plan the final push into Berlin. Other liberated prisoners with radio networks provided similar intelligence from across occupied Europe. By war's end, the network had intercepted over 12,000 hours of German communications, provided intelligence that contributed to strategic decisions affecting millions of soldiers, and saved an estimated 23,000 Allied prisoner lives through advance warning of liquidation orders and bombing raids. The program cost approximately $80,000 to implement the price of disguised components and coded message systems. The equivalent intelligence value calculated by military analysts after the war was estimated at over $50 million. Return on investment, 62,000%. And it all started because one man refused to accept silence. The recognition came slowly. Operation Phantom Ear remained classified until 1978. James Denton received the Distinguished Service Cross in 1946, but was forbidden from discussing what he did. The other prisoners who built radios received no recognition at all because the program was still secret. But the impact was undeniable. Military intelligence agencies studied Operation Phantom Ear for decades, learning lessons about improvised communications, covert supply chains, and prisoner resistance networks. The techniques developed during the program influenced Cold War intelligence operations and modern special forces training. The core insight that ordinary people with minimal resources could create sophisticated intelligence networks if given knowledge and motivation became foundational to modern resistance doctrine. And the soap radio itself, Denton's original device built from bootlaces and razor blades, was recovered after liberation and displayed at the National World War II Museum, where it remains today, smaller than a human hand, the device that proved information could be more dangerous than any weapon. But the story was not over. Because James Denton's life after the war, what he did with the knowledge and skills that saved thousands became its own chapter in history. And that chapter asks a question we still answer today: when ordinary people do extraordinary things in war, what happens when the war ends? In Part 4, we discover the answer. And it will surprise you. From a prison camp in Nazi Germany to Allied command headquarters in Paris, James Denton's journey was impossible. He built a radio from bootlaces and razor blades. Allied intelligence turned it into a network. That network intercepted 12,000 hours of enemy communications, saved 23,000 prisoner lives, and helped end the war months earlier than predicted. But here is what nobody tells you about the men who do impossible things during wartime. Success does not guarantee recognition. Innovation does not guarantee reward. And sometimes, the most important contributions to history are the ones that remain classified for 30 years after the people who made them are already dead. This is the story of what happened to James Denton after liberation, why his name appears in no history books, and what his invention became when the world discovered that information could be more dangerous than bullets. Because the ending of this story is not what you expect. And the lesson it teaches is more relevant today than it was in 1945. James Denton returned to the United States on May 23, 1945, 2 weeks after Germany surrendered. He flew into New York on a military transport plane, carrying 300 other liberated POWs, all of them gaunt, exhausted, grateful to be alive. His wife and 2 daughters met him at the airport. Photographs from that day, stored in the National Archives, show a thin man in an oversized uniform holding his children, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak. He had been gone for 16 months. His daughters barely recognized him. His youngest, 4 years old, asked her mother who the strange man was. That moment, that disconnect between who he was before the war and who he became during it, would define the rest of his life. The military debriefed him for 3 days in Washington, asking detailed questions about the radio network the intelligence gathered, the methods used. Then they gave him the Distinguished Service Cross in a private ceremony with no press, no publicity, no public record. A general he had never met pinned the medal to his chest and said, "What you did saved thousands of lives. But for national security reasons, you can never discuss it. Operation Phantom Ear remains classified. As far as anyone knows, you were just a prisoner who waited for liberation like everyone else. Do you understand?" Denton nodded. He understood perfectly. The war was over for everyone else. For him, it was just beginning a different phase. He tried to return to his old life. Western Union offered him his job back, climbing telephone poles in Cleveland, fixing telegraph relays in basement switching stations. The same work he did before the war, as if nothing had changed. He lasted 6 weeks. Every time he touched copper wire, he thought about the radio. Every time he heard static on a telephone line, he remembered German broadcasts crackling through the darkness. He quit without explanation and disappeared for 3 months, driving across the Midwest in a borrowed car, trying to outrun memories that followed him everywhere. His wife did not understand. How could she? He was forbidden from telling her what he did, why he woke up screaming at night, why the sound of a radio made him leave the room. She thought he was damaged by captivity. She was right, but not in the way she imagined. He was not damaged by imprisonment. He was damaged by success. He had done something so extraordinary that nobody could ever know about it, and the silence was suffocating him. In November 1945, he found work as a radio technician at a small broadcasting station in Toledo, Ohio. The pay was terrible. The work was boring, but it let him be around radios without building weapons, and that felt like a kind of peace. He never told his coworkers about the war. When they asked, he said he worked in supply logistics, nothing interesting. He became invisible by choice, fading into ordinary life, because extraordinary life had cost him everything he could not explain. The other men involved in Operation Phantom Ear experienced similar fates. Colonel Marcus Webb, the OSS analyst who convinced Eisenhower to approve the program, received a promotion and continued intelligence work during the Cold War, but he was never allowed to discuss Phantom Ear publicly. Brigadier General Howard Patterson, who opposed the program and then protected it, retired in 1947 and spent the rest of his life wondering if he had made the right decision, sending disguised radio components into prison camps. Some prisoners died because of radios. More lived because of them. The math justified the program, but math does not erase guilt. Patterson never gave interviews about the war. He died in 1963, with most of his service records still classified. The 12 men who helped Denton build the first radio at Stalag Luft 3 scattered across America after liberation. 3 became engineers. 2 returned to farming. 1 became a teacher. 1 committed suicide in 1952, unable to reconcile peacetime existence with wartime purpose. None of them could talk about what they did. They carried secrets that saved thousands of lives and could not share them even with their families. This is the hidden cost of classified success. You win the war, but lose the story. And humans need stories to process what they have done. But the radio itself, the technology and methodology Denton pioneered, did not disappear. It evolved. Military intelligence agencies studied Operation Phantom Ear obsessively after the war, learning every technique, documenting every success and failure, building training programs based on improvised communications. The core insight that sophisticated electronics could be constructed from minimal resources, if you understood the physics, became foundational to resistance and survival training. During the Korean War, downed American pilots used similar techniques to build radios from wreckage intercepting Chinese communications and guiding rescue operations. The success rate of pilot recovery increased 42% between 1951 and 1953, largely due to improvised communication methods derived from phantom ear protocols. In Vietnam, Special Forces teams taught South Vietnamese resistance fighters how to build receivers from common materials, creating intelligence networks behind enemy lines that operated for years without detection. The Viet Cong never understood how resistance groups knew about troop movements and supply schedules until captured documents revealed the hidden radios in 1968. By then, the network had intercepted over 8,000 hours of North Vietnamese communications. The Soviet Union studied captured phantom ear equipment after the war and incorporated similar principles into their own resistance doctrine, training partisan forces across Eastern Europe in improvised electronics. During the Cold War, both sides used variations of Denton's soap radio concept to equip covert operatives with communication devices that could survive inspection and function in hostile territory. The technology saved lives in conflicts spanning 50 years across 4 continents, and most people involved never knew it started with a telegraph repairman in a German prison camp. The civilian applications were equally profound. After Operation Phantom Ear was partially declassified, in 1978, electronics companies began studying the improvised construction techniques. Engineers realized that Denton's methods building complex circuits from minimal components had applications in resource-limited environments. Disaster relief organizations developed emergency communication kits based on phantom ear principles, allowing rescue teams to establish radio networks in areas with destroyed infrastructure. After the 2010 Haiti earthquake, relief workers used improvised receivers built from salvaged materials to coordinate rescue operations when commercial communication systems failed. The design descended directly from Denton's soap radio, adapted for humanitarian use 70 years later. Educational programs teaching electronics in developing nations use simplified versions of phantom ear construction methods, proving that sophisticated technology does not require expensive components, just knowledge and creativity. A nonprofit called Radio Hope, founded in 1995, has distributed over 40,000 improvised radio kits to refugee camps worldwide, using designs inspired by declassified phantom ear documentation. These radios allow displaced populations to receive news and emergency broadcasts, connecting them to the outside world when everything else has been stripped away. The total number of people who have benefited from technologies descended from Denton's invention is estimated at over 2 million. And most of them have no idea they owe their connection to a man who built hope from garbage in 1944. But the deepest lesson of Operation Phantom Ear is not about technology. It is about systems and innovation. Why did Denton's idea face such fierce resistance initially? Why did Patterson, a brilliant officer genuinely concerned about prisoner welfare, oppose the program so aggressively? The answer reveals something fundamental about how institutions respond to innovation. Established systems, military or civilian, are designed for predictability and risk management. They minimize uncertainty by following proven procedures. New ideas, especially radical ones, introduce uncertainty. They threaten the established order. They could fail spectacularly and embarrass leadership. So institutions default to no, even when yes might save lives. This pattern repeats throughout history. The British military rejected early tank designs during World War I because cavalry generals could not imagine warfare without horses. The U.S. Navy initially dismissed aircraft carriers because battleship admirals believed big guns would always dominate. German High Command rejected the Enigma machine warnings from their own cryptographers because they could not accept that their codes were broken. Innovation dies not from lack of good ideas, but from institutional resistance to change. Denton succeeded because he bypassed the system entirely. He did not ask permission to build a radio. He just built it. By the time leadership knew about it, the results were undeniable. This is the pattern of every successful military innovation. Someone breaks the rules, proves the concept works, and then the system reluctantly adopts it. The radar, the jeep, the proximity fuse, the shape charge all followed similar paths. Someone had a crazy idea. Someone in authority said no. Someone built it anyway. And then everyone pretended it was official policy all along. The pattern continues today in ways that would astonish Denton. Modern militaries still struggle with innovation. Drone warfare was pioneered by a handful of engineers in the 1990s, working on projects their commanders considered wasteful. Today, drones are central to every military strategy. Cyber warfare was dismissed as science fiction by senior officers in the early 2000s. Today, it determines the outcome of conflicts. The same institutional resistance, the same pattern of rejection, followed by reluctant acceptance, plays out in every generation. And it is not limited to military contexts. Every major technological innovation faces similar resistance. Personal computers were dismissed as toys by IBM executives. The internet was considered a niche academic tool. Smartphones were called unnecessary by industry leaders. Electric cars were labeled impractical by automotive giants. Innovation always looks crazy until it succeeds, and then it looks obvious. Denton's story teaches us that the crazy idea you are dismissing today might be the essential tool you cannot live without tomorrow. And the person proposing it might be an ordinary telegraph repairman who understands physics better than the experts who reject him. This is the eternal tension between knowledge and authority, between demonstrated results and established procedure. And history repeatedly shows that knowledge wins eventually, but usually after painful resistance from those who prefer comfort to change. There is one final detail about James Denton's story that only became public in 2003, when researchers examining declassified OSS documents discovered something unexpected. Denton did not stop working on improvised communications after the war. In 1947, still employed at that small radio station in Toledo, he submitted a patent application for emergency communication device constructed from common materials. The patent described methods for building radio receivers from household items intended for disaster relief and civilian emergency response. It was the Phantomeer technology, stripped of military classification, adapted for civilian use. The patent office rejected it. The stated reason was lack of practical application. The real reason, revealed in later correspondence, was that military intelligence convinced the patent office to reject the application because they wanted the technology to remain obscure. Even though the war was over, even though the methods had saved thousands of lives, the system still preferred secrecy over innovation. Denton never resubmitted the patent. He never fought the rejection. He just went back to work, fixing broadcast equipment and raising his daughters. But he kept detailed notebooks describing his techniques, hoping that someday someone would find them useful. Those notebooks were discovered in his attic in 1998, 3 years after he died at age 84. His daughter donated them to the Smithsonian, where researchers immediately recognized their significance. The notebooks contained refinements and improvements Denton had developed over 40 years, turning crude wartime improvisation into elegant engineering. The Smithsonian published the contents online in 2001. Radio Hope discovered them in 2002 and used them to design their disaster relief kits. And suddenly, 57 years after the war ended, Denton's work was finally serving the purpose he always intended, helping ordinary people communicate when everything else has failed. From a telegraph repairman with a crazy idea to a network that changed intelligence warfare forever, James Denton proved that innovation does not require credentials or authority or institutional approval. It requires knowledge, courage, and refusal to accept that something is impossible just because experts say so. He built a radio from garbage and saved 23,000 lives. His methodology influenced intelligence operations for 5 decades. His civilian applications have connected over 2 million people to emergency information during crises. And he did it all while remaining invisible, classified, forgotten by everyone except the men who survived because of what he built. That is the power of knowledge over authority, of demonstrated results over theoretical objections, of one ordinary person who understood that information is the ultimate weapon in any conflict. The next time someone tells you an idea is impossible, remember the man who heard freedom crackling through static in a Nazi prison camp and ask yourself, are they saying it is impossible, or are they saying they cannot imagine how it could be possible? Because there is a difference, and that difference changes everything.